Hi everyone, welcome back to part 5 in the conclusion of the immigration series. By now you should have a better understanding of our immigration program. But to finish Article 15, we have to answer two questions. First, does this policy help you and our country like the government and the media tell you it does? Well, to answer that question, no. This policy isn't good for you, isn't good for your family or our country. And it doesn't matter whether you came here yesterday or 100 years ago. You can't afford to continue this policy. And today, I'll show you why you can't afford it. Then we'll address the second question. Why does our government continue to do it anyway? And how they use mass immigration to hide the failed outcomes of other bad policies so that these problems get bigger and bigger and harder to solve. So first, why is this program bad for you? Let's start with the cost that you pay to manage the giant bureaucracy required to process and manage 1 million new immigrants a year. That's a lot of money. Then add the cost to process and manage 5 million work visas every year. That's even more money. And I don't even know how much money that is, but I know it's a lot. And I know that money, it should have been invested in our future. But that amount is peanuts compared to what it costs to provide for their living expenses once they're here. Those living expenses are mostly paid through our various welfare programs. That's how you get to our over $1 trillion a year welfare expense. So when you compare the welfare spending to our immigrant population, it's a pretty good match because welfare spending keeps being driven up by this unprecedented and sustained influx of immigrants. Now, I'm not implying that every immigrant that comes to our country ends up on welfare, because many don't. Nor am I saying that most immigrants don't work when they come here, because most do. But the majority of these immigrants are from third world countries. This creates a huge influx of low-skilled workers coming into our country. And the low-skilled jobs that they perform don't provide good enough wages and benefits to support a family. So to fill that gap, they have to get help from our welfare programs. And of course, you pay for all of this. Now, it isn't a coincidence this massive welfare increase mirrors the massive increase in immigrants. But it isn't just immigrants that end up on welfare. Because between the over 1 million immigrants we receive each year and the 5 million workers that our government brings in each year, millions of them skilled with the worker visa program, these workers are often willing to work for lower wages and get hired for jobs that Americans should have filled. So these large groups, they displace both skilled and unskilled American workers. And how do these unemployed Americans survive if they're unemployed or relegated to a lower paying job? You guessed it, welfare. We have over 90 million Americans who have to rely on Medicaid for health care. Over 80 million Americans that can't even feed themselves without the government's help. 16 million Americans are disabled. Millions more are either unemployed or just simply have given up on looking for a job. So even if immigrants and foreigners here on work visas don't require welfare benefits, they often displace an American worker that now has to seek welfare or disability benefits to provide for themselves and their family. You lose either way. But don't forget about remittance payments abroad. According to Forbes magazine, even in 2017, immigrants sent $148 billion out of our country and back to their home country. And while immigrants who support friends and family in their home country, that's a noble, it's bad for you and our country since this money leaves our economy and our country. And that was in 2017. We have added close to 10 million additional immigrants since then. This number is likely over $200 billion now. These hundreds of billions of dollars are gone from our economy and your future every year. And this quickly adds up to trillions over the last few decades. This giant loss of capital alone is reason enough to rethink this program. You get poorer every year this program goes on. And how do we pay for all these expenses and this loss of capital? Easy. Taxes and debt go up. When you spend over $1 trillion a year on welfare, millions more for all these other costs, and then ship hundreds of billions of dollars out of the country every year, You either have to keep increasing the taxes or take on more debt. And these costs are so high, we've had to do both. Because even increasing taxes, shown here, can't cover the cost of these failed policies. We've had to resort to ever-increasing amounts of debt to hide the failures. We know how dismal our national debt looks at $36 trillion. And about 1 out of every 4 of those dollars in taxes you pay already doesn't go to any government service. It's spent just to pay the interest on the debt. And I hate to remind you, but trillions of dollars of this debt, it isn't even real money. It was created out of thin air. But the money you take from your family to pay for this interest, it isn't printed out of thin air. It comes from your hard labor. So it isn't surprising that when we compare our national debt to our percent migrants, increases in immigrants contribute to the large national debt runoff. And ironically, they've been telling us for years that more immigration is the answer to these problems. But after 60 years, the results are conclusive. More immigration isn't fixing any problems. Actually, most of these problems were minor before the immigration surge started. Look at the debt in 1960 before this surge started. It was manageable. And welfare spending in 1960, still pretty low also. Now they're both huge. Excessive immigration is contributing to this problem. It's not fixing it. But no matter what, this additional supply of labor, both skilled and unskilled, it drives down everyone's wages. Now, post-COVID was an exception since our government was paying everyone not to work, but it's simple supply and demand. Millions of immigrant workers, millions more people here on work visas, increases the labor supply, and this competition for jobs drives down wages and the value of your benefits. That's why you pay health care benefits for 1 out of every 4 Americans. Why should employers provide health care or wages high enough to feed a family when they can hire cheap labor and have you pay for their employees' essential needs? Bottom line, you make less and have less as a result of all this new labor entering the workforce. So whether you immigrated here yesterday or 100 years ago, should be pretty easy to conclude we don't need any more immigration today. These people are playing musical chairs with our future. We already have more people than we do chairs. They keep taking chairs away while they add over 1 million more people every year. And when the music stops, a lot of us aren't going to have a chair. So what about the answer to the second question? Why does our government do it anyway, even if it isn't good for our country? Well, they have their reasons. So let's talk about why endless immigration is so important to them. Immigration is part of a broader plan to eliminate people like you, free and independent middle-class Americans that still have enough power and wealth to create the change that our country needs. If you watch my Death March series, you already know how this scheme works. And immigration checks all of the boxes to keep you moving along on this march. It bankrupts you with higher taxes to pay for the increased welfare demand. It saddles you with $1 trillion of debt. It brings in people to take your job, and if you do have a job, it drives down your wages and benefits. In this scheme, it's been super effective. Remember in the Death March series, we covered the number of people that are already awarded the state. If we keep this up, you'll be one of these wards in no time. That is, if you aren't already. And you'll also be too poor and too powerless to do anything to stop the implementation of their two-tiered society. And those 2 tiers include only a rowing class and a surf class. And in case you forgot, you'll be part of the surf class. Now you probably would have noticed this a long time ago, that the current plan is a dismal failure. And we'd already be working together to fix these problems. But by using this carefully crafted immigration Ponzi scheme, coupled with unlimited debt, and with help from the media to keep you distracted, they've been able to hide all these problems below the surface. Sure, some of us do see them, but most of us have been fooled into thinking one of these 2 offer a solution to the problem. But they don't. And many others, they haven't even seen the problem yet. These problems can't be hidden forever though. But they don't have to be. They only need to hide them long enough that they get so big that they become almost impossible to solve. And you get past the point of no return on your death march. once there's no going back, then the truth won't be hidden under the surface anymore. But the truth will be little consolation then, since it'll be too late for you to do anything about it. Because without all of this excessive immigration, you would have already noticed the failing state of our economy. But instead, you're led to believe the economy is doing great. Why? Because the economy does grow, but only because we create millions of new consumers each year by importing them. And then we build the equivalent of 5 major new cities every year to house them. And even this isn't enough for the economy to thrive or for our government to balance the budget. So our government has to inject trillions of debt spending every year into the economy to keep the illusion going. And like any good Ponzi scheme, you need more and more participation to keep it going. And every year we bring increasing numbers of immigrants and non-immigrants. And every year, more debt also to keep this scheme going. Take a look at the budget deficit. The deficit is the amount each year that the government spends beyond the tax revenues that it receives. So basically, it's how much the debt's going to go up each year. The government has to spend increasing amounts of money beyond the taxes every year because it gets harder and harder to hide the outcomes of these failed policies. You would have noticed that the stock market, artificially propped up with these new consumers in debt, it doesn't have the market value that they tell you it has. Sadly, most of us, we build our future on this scheme. But when this Ponzi scheme ends, the market bears, they'll be out in full force. But you would have also noticed that it's impossible for a country to survive that has millions of working age people out of the workforce due to disability, disinterest, or welfare. People that are consuming resources without creating any. We already talked about the 12 million working age Americans on disability that you pay for. But there are millions more not working also due to a lack of interest. And millions others that don't work and get welfare benefits. Millions of people consuming without creating. It's an impossible situation to sustain. But this is where immigration does help. We import workers to do the work that these people used to do, so the economy keeps moving along. That makes it less obvious to you. But the cost of paying for people to not be productive and the cost to replace them with people that will is bankrupting yours and your children's future. You would have surely noticed that the Social Security Trust Fund is destined to go broke in the next 10 years. Part of it's due to the huge number of working age Americans on disability. And being on Social Security is a true Ponzi scheme, these missing workers are expediting the bankruptcy of this program. But also the failure of our political class to implement the necessary but unpopular solutions to this problem that we discussed in Article 4. So instead they use an inrush of new immigration workers, many of which do pay Social Security taxes, to try to hide this problem a little bit longer so they can get you a little further along on the march. These immigration workers' Social Security taxes, they do postpone the bankruptcy, but they won't prevent it unless something dramatic is done. And when this huge influx of immigrant workers begins to draw from Social Security, it's game over for Social Security for sure. But you would have noticed that the American family, it's diminished to almost nothing. The average family doesn't even earn enough or have enough children to maintain the population. The American birth rate has dropped 50% in just the last 60 years. Our population would be dropping without immigration. Why? Because even with both parents working in many families, they still can't afford to have more kids because of this failed plan. A plan that's driven down labor rates so low that both parents have to work in most households. And even that extra income isn't enough to afford more children, since most working Americans pay about 50% of all their wages in taxes to the government to perpetuate these failures. Now, this immigration Ponzi scheme is used to temporarily hide a lot of problems in our country. My goal is to end this scheme before it brings about the end for us. Because if we have any intention of fixing our country's problems, we have to solve these problems, not mask them by introducing 1 million new potential and expensive new problems every year that have to be addressed. So what needs done? Legal immigration has to be immediately paused and reviewed with plans for significant reductions in numbers. and I mean significant. Now, this is an important first step, but our refugee and asylum programs, they just need stopped. And that includes the policy that forces us to harbor every person who shows up on our border and claims asylum. New work visas must be temporarily halted till a better understanding is gained as to why we lack this skill set, and until a plan is put in place to address it. There are few skill sets that aren't readily available in America. And if there are skills not here in the right quantity, we have some of the best schools, colleges, and trade schools the world over. We should develop that talent here. But to do that, we have to get the people to do that. We need to get a lot of people off of disability and welfare and get them back into the workforce. And while there may always be a need for some type of work visa program, it'll be drastically reduced. And being here as a permanent resident but not a citizen should exclude you from welfare benefits. It can't be possible to show up in our country and have American taxpayers pay people's living expenses when millions of Americans can barely provide for their own living expenses. This should be a no-brainer. This isn't a complicated problem to fix, but we need more elected officials willing to work on our behalf rather than on those of foreign countries. And when we end this scheme, the failures of the last 60 years that we just talked about will come to the surface and be more apparent. But I can tell you now, ending this scheme will only expose these problems, not create them. These problems are already here. And immigration coupled with debt, it just hides them. But be prepared. The government and the media, they'll be sure to tell you that stopping immigration has created these problems. But we know better now. Stopping immigration, it only reveals them. And revealing and recognizing these problems is the first step to solving them. The failures in our country are so plentiful, we can't fix any one problem in a vacuum because each failure is intertwined with other failures. The current plan is to attempt to infinitely sustain these failed policies by increasing the debt and importing millions to hide those failures. But that isn't going to work. It'll take a comprehensive approach that addresses all these problems, and immigration is no exception. That's where my doctrine comes in. It addresses all these problems in a comprehensive and systematic fashion. It offers real solutions and puts Americans in their future first in actions, not just in words. And that shouldn't be the novel concept that it is today. I'll see you next time.